A man lived in a storage jar in ancient Athens and told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight. History remembers him as one of the most influential philosophers who ever lived. His name was Diogenes, and everything you think you know about living a good life, he would have told you was backwards. Picture this. Around 413 BC, somewhere on the southern coast of the Black Sea, a boy is born into privilege. His father runs the bank. Not a bank, the bank. Ctesias is the man authorized by the city of Sinope to exchange foreign currencies, to mint coins, to control the flow of money through one of the wealthiest trading ports in the Greek world. This matters because Sinope isn't some backwater village. It's a Milesian colony, a crucial node in the commercial networks connecting the Mediterranean to the vast territories beyond. Ships arrive daily carrying grain from the Scythian plains, timber from the forests to the north. Slaves, wine, olive oil, money flows through Sinope like water, and Hycesius controls the valves. Young Diogenes grows up with every advantage the ancient world can offer. Private tutors teach him to read and write, skills that most people in his era never acquire. He learns to quote Homer and Hesiod from memory, can recite passages from the tragic poets, studies the works that form the backbone of Greek education. He trains in athletics because that's what wealthy boys do, learning to wrestle and run and throw the javelin. He learns to ride horses, a particularly expensive skill that marks him as belonging to the upper classes. Everything about his childhood screams privilege, preparation, expectation. His father's position isn't just about money. Hycesius holds the title of Epimeletes, a magistrate whose specific duties varied from city to city, but always involved significant civic responsibility. We don't know exactly what Diogenes' father did in this role, but we know it mattered. Archaeological digs in the region have uncovered coins from this period, minted between 360 and 320 BC, bearing what's almost certainly Hycesius' name stamped right into the metal. Physical evidence that this family controlled actual power. Diogenes follows his father into this world. He takes a position, probably the same magistrate role his father held. He's being groomed for a life of civic leadership and commercial success. He's maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, positioned exactly where every Greek parent wanted their son to be: respectable, influential, wealthy, secure. Then everything explodes. The details have been argued over for 2 millennia, and honestly, we'll probably never know exactly what happened. What we do know for certain, because the coins themselves survive as evidence, is that someone tampered with Sinope's currency. The technical term is adulteration, but what it means is that somebody was either minting fake coins, shaving metal off real ones, or altering the dyes used to stamp them. This is serious. Currency manipulation threatens the entire economic system. It destroys trust between cities, ruins merchants, can collapse trade networks. In the ancient world, this isn't white-collar crime. This is attacking the foundations of civilization itself. Some ancient sources blame Hycesius, others blame Diogenes. A few say both were involved. One tradition claims Diogenes committed the fraud and fled while his father, who oversaw the treasury, was arrested and died in prison. Another version has them working together. A third suggests Diogenes was innocent but took the fall. We have no way to sort truth from legend at this distance. What we do have is Diogenes' own confession. In a work called the Paudalus, which doesn't survive except in references, Diogenes apparently admitted to adulterating the coinage. But here's where things get philosophically interesting. That phrase, defacing the currency, becomes the central metaphor of his entire life's work. Was he confessing to an actual crime, or was he using the scandal as a teaching tool, a way to explain what his philosophy was really about? Because whether the crime happened or not, the exile was real. Diogenes was forced out of Sinope. In his world, in his time, this was catastrophic. Being separated from your homeland meant being cut off from your ancestors, from the gods of your city, from the community that defined your identity. You couldn't be buried with your family. You had no legal protections. You were nobody, nowhere, nothing. Most exiles spent their lives trying to return, or at least trying to rebuild some version of what they'd lost. Diogenes did the opposite. Somewhere between Sinope and Athens, something fundamental shifted in him. Maybe it was the shock of losing everything. Maybe it was the shame. Maybe it was freedom. Plutarch, writing centuries later, said that the hardships of exile transformed Diogenes into a philosopher. The man who'd had everything learned what it meant to have nothing, and discovered he preferred nothing. There's a story, though we can't verify it, that Diogenes consulted the oracle at Delphi. This is what you did in the ancient world when you needed guidance. You travelled to these sacred sites where priests and priestesses, supposedly inspired by the gods, would give you cryptic answers to your questions. The oracle's response to Diogenes was supposedly, falsify the currency. The Greek word used can mean counterfeit, deface, alter, or falsify. It's beautifully ambiguous. Was the oracle telling him to commit the crime that would lead to his exile? Was it telling him to embrace what had already happened and make it his mission? Or was it speaking metaphorically from the start, telling him to challenge and overturn the false values that society treats as legitimate currency? We don't even know if he actually visited the oracle. The story is suspiciously similar to the kind of divine calling narrative that gets attached to famous philosophers after they're famous. Socrates had his oracle story. Why wouldn't Diogenes? The interweaving of life and legend in his case makes it nearly impossible to separate fact from myth. What matters is that Diogenes took this idea, whether it came from an oracle or from his own reflection on what had happened to him, and made it his life's work. He would deface the currency. Not literal coins, but the false currency of reputation, status, wealth, power, all the things Greek society valued. He would expose these things as worthless, as arbitrary conventions that people mistook for genuine value. He arrived in Athens probably in his mid-30s, an exile with nothing. Athens was the intellectual centre of the Greek world, home to Plato's academy, to Socrates' legacy, to endless philosophical debates in the agora and the gymnasia. It was also crowded, filthy, disease-ridden, and deeply stratified by class. If you had money, Athens was glorious. If you didn't, it was brutal. Diogenes sought out Antisthenes, an older philosopher who'd studied under Socrates. Antisthenes had developed a reputation for harsh asceticism and blunt speech. He taught that virtue was the only good, that everything else, wealth, pleasure, reputation, was worthless. He rejected conventional education and formal philosophical systems in favour of practical wisdom and self-sufficiency. In other words, he was exactly the kind of teacher Diogenes was looking for. Antisthenes didn't want students. He actively tried to repel people who approached him, testing their commitment, protecting his time and energy. When Diogenes showed up asking to learn from him, Antisthenes told him to go away. Diogenes refused. Antisthenes threatened him. Diogenes didn't move. According to the story, Antisthenes eventually raised his walking stick, ready to strike Diogenes to drive him off. Diogenes simply said, "Strike, for you will not find any stick hard enough to drive me away as long as you continue to speak." This moment reveals everything about Diogenes' character: the unwavering determination, the complete commitment, the willingness to endure anything for what he believed mattered. And notice the condition: as long as you continue to speak. He wasn't being stubborn for its own sake. He wanted the wisdom Antisthenes possessed, and he would pay any price to get it. Antisthenes accepted him. Whether the timeline actually works for Diogenes to have studied at the Cynicism, the gymnasium where Antisthenes taught, is debatable. The dates are fuzzy. But what's clear is that Diogenes absorbed Antisthenes' core ideas and then radicalized them beyond anything his teacher had imagined. From Antisthenes, Diogenes learned to prioritize virtue over society's rules. He learned religious skepticism, questioning the elaborate myths and rituals that dominated Greek life. He learned that action mattered more than theory, that philosophy was something you lived, not just something you discussed. But where Antisthenes taught these ideas, Diogenes embodied them so completely that he became a living challenge to everyone around him. He also learned about Socrates, who died before Diogenes arrived in Athens, but whose influence saturated the city's philosophical culture. Socrates had spent his life questioning people who claimed to be wise, exposing their ignorance through careful dialectical interrogation. He'd compared himself to a gadfly, constantly stinging the lazy horse of Athens to keep it awake and alert. He'd been executed for it, convicted of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. Diogenes saw himself as continuing Socrates' mission, but with a crucial difference. Socrates had been polite, using questions to lead people towards self-awareness. Diogenes had no patience for politeness. He would use mockery, shock, his own body as a philosophical weapon. When Plato was asked what kind of man Diogenes was, he supposedly answered, "A Socrates gone mad." The description is perfect. Both men were trying to wake people from their comfortable delusions. Both were willing to face social consequences for their philosophy. But where Socrates used reason and dialogue, Diogenes used outrage and spectacle. Athens had no idea what was about to hit it. Diogenes needed a place to live. For a brief period, he tried to arrange conventional housing. There's a reference in his letters to asking someone to find him a cottage. But the person took too long. Or maybe Diogenes realized he didn't actually need a cottage because he ended up doing something that would become one of the most famous images in philosophy. He moved into a pythos. A pythos is a large ceramic storage jar, the kind used for wine or grain or oil. They were enormous, big enough to stand inside, and they were everywhere in Athens. Diogenes found one in the Metroon, a public building in the Agora, turned it on its side, and made it his home. This wasn't homelessness as we understand it. This was a choice, a calculated philosophical statement. The Agora was the busiest public space in Athens, the commercial and social heart of the city. By living there, in a storage jar, Diogenes made himself impossible to ignore. Every day, hundreds of people walked past the philosopher living in a jar. Some laughed, some were disgusted, some were intrigued. All of them had to confront the question he was posing simply by existing. Why do you need so much? Later writers, starting with Seneca in the 1st century AD, mistranslated pythos as barrel. This is why you see medieval and Renaissance paintings showing Diogenes in a wooden barrel. But barrels didn't exist in ancient Greece. He lived in a ceramic jar, which is both more accurate and somehow more absurd. The decision came from watching a mouse. At least that's the story Diogenes told. He observed a mouse going about its business, eating whatever it found, sleeping wherever it happened to be, adapting instantly to any circumstance, needing nothing, fearing nothing. The mouse taught him that adaptability was everything, that the less you needed, the freer you became. This realization became the foundation of what he called ascesis, training. But this wasn't training to acquire new skills or knowledge. This was training to shed dependencies, to reduce yourself to the essential core, to discover how little you actually needed to survive and even thrive. He owned almost nothing: a cloak to keep warm, a walking stick, a small bag to carry food, and initially, a cup. The cup story is crucial because it shows how relentlessly Diogenes pursued simplicity. One day he saw a boy drinking water by cupping his hands. Immediately, Diogenes threw away his cup, saying the boy had outdone him in simplicity. If you could drink without a cup, why own one? This might seem like pointless extremism, but there was method in it. Every possession is a dependency. Every dependency is a potential source of suffering. If you need a cup and it breaks, you suffer. If you never needed the cup in the first place, you're free. This was autarkia, self-sufficiency, the cornerstone of Cynic philosophy. You needed nothing external for happiness. Virtue was internal, achievable by anyone willing to train themselves properly. The less you required from the world, the less power the world had over you. His approach to food followed the same logic. He begged, yes, but not as a beggar begs. He saw begging as teaching. The citizens of Athens should support philosophers, just as they supported athletes and politicians. Philosophy benefited the city more than either of those groups, so why shouldn't philosophers receive public support? When people gave him food, they weren't doing him a favour. He was allowing them to participate in something worthwhile. He ate whatever he could get: bread, vegetables, sometimes meat. The sources say he ate raw meat, which probably wasn't his preference, but demonstrated that cooking was another unnecessary dependency. If you could eat food raw, why did you need fire, pots, a kitchen, a house? Each elimination was another step toward freedom. But here's what makes Diogenes fascinating beyond simple asceticism. He wasn't advocating universal poverty. He never said everyone should live in a jar and eat raw meat. His lifestyle was a demonstration, not a prescription. He was proving that happiness didn't require what society insisted it required. If he could be content with nothing, then surely people with comfortable homes and regular meals had no excuse for unhappiness. The method was ascesis, but the goal was transformation. He wanted to wake people up, to shock them out of their comfortable sleepwalking through life, and shock them he did, because reducing possessions to zero was only the beginning. What really scandalized Athens was what Diogenes did in public. He masturbated in the agora. This isn't a detail historians quietly ignore. It's central to understanding his philosophy. When people objected, which they absolutely did, he had a ready response. If only it were as easy to relieve hunger by rubbing one's belly. His point was simple and devastating. Everyone masturbates. Everyone knows everyone masturbates, but convention demands you hide it. Pretend it doesn't happen. Maintain a collective fiction. Why? If the act itself isn't shameful in private, what makes it shameful in public? Nothing except arbitrary social rules. He urinated on people who insulted him. He defecated in the theatre. He ate in the marketplace, which sounds innocuous until you understand that eating in public was considered crude behaviour for respectable Athenians. They ate at home, in private, maintaining the fiction that they were above such base physical needs. Diogenes refused every fiction. He performed bodily functions wherever he happened to be when the need arose. When criticised, he pointed out the obvious. These are natural acts that every human performs. The shame attached to them is artificial, a social construction designed to maintain hierarchies and pretenses. This was living according to nature or physis rather than convention or nomos. The distinction was crucial to Cynic philosophy. Nature was what genuinely mattered, what was actually necessary for human flourishing. Convention was everything else, all the arbitrary rules society imposed, most of which served no real purpose except maintaining existing power structures. Plato's Academy, the most prestigious philosophical school in Athens, taught that the physical world was inferior to the realm of eternal forms, accessible only through pure reason. Diogenes thought this was nonsense. The physical world was all we had. Our bodies were natural. Their needs and functions were natural. Pretending otherwise was living in delusion. So he made himself a living argument against convention. Every time someone saw him eating in the street, or sleeping in his jar, or relieving himself without seeking privacy, they had to confront the question, why do we hide what everyone does? What are we afraid of? The answer, Diogenes believed, was that people were afraid of being exposed as merely human, as animals with animal needs. Society constructed elaborate systems of etiquette and propriety to maintain the illusion that humans were somehow above or separate from nature. Diogenes obliterated that illusion daily, but his shamelessness went beyond bodily functions. He showed no respect for social class, no deference to wealth or position. He treated slaves and aristocrats with exactly the same casual disregard. When wealthy men tried to impress him with their possessions, he mocked them. When powerful men tried to intimidate him, he laughed. There's a story that perfectly captures this. A man showed Diogenes his expensive house with its beautifully decorated rooms and valuable furnishings. The man was clearly proud, expecting admiration. Diogenes walked through the house, examined everything carefully, then spat in the man's face. When the outraged owner demanded an explanation, Diogenes said, "I saw nothing else to spit on." The house was so ostentatious, so covered in precious materials and fine decorations, that the only suitable target for his contempt was the owner himself. The story might be apocryphal, but it captured something true about how Diogenes operated. Material wealth wasn't just irrelevant to virtue, it was often an obstacle, a distraction, a source of false pride. His confrontations with Plato were legendary. Plato represented everything Diogenes opposed: abstract theorizing divorced from lived experience, elitism disguised as philosophy, the prioritization of pure thought over practical wisdom. When Plato defined humans as featherless bipeds, presenting this as a philosophical insight, Diogenes brought a plucked chicken to the academy and announced, "Here is Plato's man." The mockery was devastating because it exposed how useless abstract definitions were. You could meet the technical criteria of Plato's definition without capturing anything essential about what makes humans human. Plato had to revise his definition to featherless bipeds with flat nails, which only proved Diogenes' point. Definitions that could be defeated by a plucked chicken weren't philosophy, they were word games. In another encounter, Plato saw Diogenes washing vegetables for his meagre meal and commented, "If you had paid court to Dionysius, you wouldn't have to wash vegetables." Dionysius was the tyrant of Syracuse, wealthy and powerful. Plato had spent time at his court, seeking patronage, trying to influence political power with philosophical wisdom. It hadn't gone well, but Plato apparently still thought engaging with tyrants was worthwhile. Diogenes replied, "If you would only have washed vegetables, you wouldn't have to be subservient to Dionysius." The exchange distilled their fundamental disagreement. Plato was willing to compromise, to engage with power on power's terms, hoping to gradually influence it toward justice. Diogenes refused all compromise. He would wash his own vegetables and remain free rather than enjoy luxury at the price of subservience. These weren't just personal conflicts between two difficult men. They represented competing visions of what philosophy should be. Plato believed philosophy required extensive education, careful reasoning, abstract thought about eternal forms. Diogenes believed philosophy was about living, about demonstrating through action what words could never fully express. Socrates had used dialogue and questioning to expose ignorance and led people toward truth. Diogenes used his body, his actions, his refusal to participate in social conventions. Where Socrates had been a gadfly, annoying but ultimately harmless, Diogenes was something fiercer. He called himself a dog, and the name stuck. The Greek word for dog is kainos. From this came Cynic, the name of the philosophical school Diogenes founded, though he would have rejected the idea that it was a school at all. There were no lectures, no formal curriculum, no systematic doctrine. There was only example. Dogs, in Greek culture, were not the beloved companions we think of today. They were scavengers, shameless, living on the margins of society, loyal to no one, concerned only with immediate survival. To call someone a dog was an insult. Diogenes embraced it. Yes, he was like a dog. He lived simply, without shame, following his natural instincts rather than social expectations. He barked at those who displeased him. He bit with his words. He was loyal only to virtue and truth, not to any person or city. The metaphor worked on multiple levels. Dogs live in the present, unconcerned with past or future. They don't hoard possessions or worry about reputation. They adapt to circumstances without complaint. They're honest in their reactions, showing affection or hostility without pretense. All of this aligned with Diogenes' philosophy. But there was also an element of deliberate provocation in accepting the insult. By calling himself a dog, Diogenes was saying, "Your insults have no power over me. Your categories and hierarchies mean nothing. I will take what you mean as degradation and transform it into a badge of honor." This was the psychological core of cynicism, complete indifference to social opinion. Not just claimed indifference, but practiced, demonstrated, lived indifference. When you truly didn't care what others thought, they lost all power over you. You became invulnerable to manipulation, immune to shame, free in a way most people couldn't imagine. The training required for this freedom was intense. It wasn't enough to intellectually accept that social opinion didn't matter. You had to retrain every instinct, every automatic response, every deep-seated desire for approval. This took years of practice, of deliberately doing things that provoked disapproval, of sitting with the discomfort until it no longer affected you. Diogenes called this hardening, making yourself tough enough to withstand anything. He would walk barefoot in snow, embrace statues in winter to accustom himself to cold, roll in hot sand during summer to train himself against heat. Physical hardship was preparation for psychological independence, but the goal wasn't toughness for its own sake. The goal was virtue, and virtue required freedom from fear. Most people's choices were constrained by fear of poverty, fear of social disapproval, fear of discomfort, fear of death. These fears made them controllable, predictable, easy to manipulate. Remove the fears and you became truly autonomous, capable of acting according to reason rather than external pressure. This is why Diogenes' lifestyle, as extreme as it appeared, wasn't the point. The point was what the lifestyle enabled: complete freedom to pursue virtue without compromise, without negotiation, without the constant calculations of social advantage that consumed most people's lives. He had no career to protect, no reputation to maintain, no possessions to safeguard, no family obligations to constrain him. He was accountable to nothing except his own conscience and his understanding of what virtue required. This made him dangerous, because a man with nothing to lose cannot be threatened. A man who fears nothing cannot be controlled. A man who wants nothing cannot be bribed. Diogenes had made himself invulnerable through radical reduction, stripping away everything that could be used against him until only the essential core remained. And that core was devoted to a single purpose: exposing the pretensions and contradictions of Athenian society, forcing people to confront the gap between their professed values and their actual behaviour, demonstrating that another way of living was possible. He was about to become impossible to ignore. Athens, in the 4th century BC, was a city of spectacle, an argument. The agora, the marketplace at the heart of the city, wasn't just where people bought vegetables and pottery. It was where philosophy happened, where politics was debated, where reputations were made and destroyed. Socrates had walked these same streets a generation earlier, stopping citizens to ask uncomfortable questions about justice and virtue. Now Diogenes had arrived, and he made Socrates look polite. The difference was methodology. Socrates asked questions, Diogenes provided demonstrations. Where Socrates would engage someone in dialectic, carefully exposing contradictions in their thinking through patient questioning, Diogenes would simply act out the contradiction. If someone praised simple living while wearing expensive clothes, Socrates might lead them through a series of questions until they recognized the inconsistency. Diogenes would spit on the person's cloak. This wasn't crude anti-intellectualism. It was a different theory of how philosophy should work. Socrates believed reason could lead people to truth. Diogenes suspected that reason was often just rationalization, that people used clever arguments to justify whatever they already wanted to do. Actions revealed truth better than words. So Diogenes lived his philosophy instead of just talking about it. Every choice he made was a philosophical argument. The storage jar he lived in, that was an argument about housing. The cloak he wore year-round, that was an argument about clothing. The way he begged for food, that was an argument about economics. His entire existence was a running critique of Athenian society. Consider what daily life looked like for most Athenians. They woke in private homes. They dressed according to social station. They performed rituals honouring the gods. They conducted business in the agora. They attended the assembly or the law courts. They returned home for meals served by slaves or family members. They worried about money, status, reputation. Their lives were structured by countless unexamined assumptions about what was necessary, proper, or valuable. Diogenes rejected all of it. He woke wherever he'd fallen asleep, usually in his jar in the Metron, a public space near the agora. He wore the same rough cloak in summer and winter, refusing to own multiple garments. He mocked religious ceremonies and openly questioned whether the gods existed. He begged his food and ate it immediately, often raw, sometimes in the marketplace itself. He owned nothing, owed nothing, feared nothing. His day had no structure except what he chose to impose. This freedom was terrifying to observe. Most people's identities were tied to their roles: citizen, father, craftsman, merchant. Strip away the roles, and what remained? Diogenes was demonstrating the answer. Strip away everything external, and you're left with a human being, a rational animal, capable of surviving and even flourishing under the most reduced circumstances. But the demonstration required constant performance. You couldn't just announce that you were living according to nature and expect people to believe you. You had to prove it repeatedly in ways that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. This is where the infamous public behaviours came in. The masturbation, the urination, the defecation in open spaces, these weren't random acts of exhibitionism. They were calculated provocations designed to force a confrontation with social convention. Here's the logic. Eating is natural and necessary. Everyone eats. Yet convention demands that eating happen in certain places, in certain ways, with certain implements. You don't eat in the street. You don't eat with your hands. You don't eat raw food. These rules have nothing to do with nutrition. They're social markers, ways of distinguishing civilized people from barbarians. Sexual desire is natural and universal. Everyone experiences it. Yet convention demands it be satisfied only in private, only in certain contexts, only with certain partners. These rules have nothing to do with the physical act. They're about maintaining social order, preserving hierarchies of gender and status. Bodily elimination is natural and inevitable. Everyone does it. Yet convention demands it happen in designated spaces, hidden from view, never mentioned in polite company. These rules have nothing to do with hygiene. They're about maintaining the fiction that humans are something other than animals. Diogenes' point was simple. If an action is natural and harms no one, why should it be shameful? Who benefits from the shame? What purpose does the concealment serve? The answer, he believed, was that social conventions existed primarily to maintain artificial hierarchies and create unnecessary dependencies. If you can only eat in your own home, you need a home. If you can only satisfy sexual desire through marriage, you need to conform to social expectations about marriage. If you can only relieve yourself in private latrines, you need access to private space. Each convention creates a requirement, and each requirement becomes a point of control. Remove the conventions and you remove the control. This was the practical implication of living according to nature, rather than nomos convention. Nature made certain demands. You needed food, water, shelter from extreme weather. Everything else was optional, added by society for its own purposes, but you couldn't just assert this theoretically. The power of convention was too strong. People would nod along while you explained the arbitrariness of social rules, then go right back to following them. You had to show them viscerally that the rules could be broken without catastrophic consequences. So Diogenes broke them, constantly, publicly, unapologetically, and nothing happened. The sky didn't fall. The gods didn't strike him down. He continued to exist, to think, to function as a human being. The only consequence was social disapproval, and he'd already made himself immune to that. This was the training he'd undergone, the hardening process. He'd systematically exposed himself to discomfort and disapproval until they no longer affected him. Physical deprivation first, cold, heat, hunger, fatigue. Then social deprivation, insult, mockery, exclusion. He'd discovered that all of it was bearable, that his sense of self didn't depend on comfort or approval. Most people never learned this. They spent their entire lives avoiding discomfort and seeking approval, which made them easy to manipulate. Threaten their comfort, and they'd comply. Threaten their reputation, and they'd conform. They were slaves to their own desires and fears. Diogenes was demonstrating an alternative. You could want nothing beyond basic survival and still be happy. You could be despised by everyone and still maintain self-respect. You could own nothing and still be free. The trick was caring about the right things, virtue, wisdom, living according to nature. Everything else was literally worthless. This teaching method was dangerous because it worked. Not on everyone, obviously. Most Athenians dismissed Diogenes as a madman or a charlatan, but some people watched him and started questioning their own lives. If he could survive on so little, why were they working so hard to accumulate more? If he could ignore social opinion, why were they so desperate for approval? If he was happy in a storage jar, what were they actually pursuing? These questions were destabilizing. Athens ran on ambition, on the desire for wealth and status and honor. The entire social system depended on people wanting these things, competing for them, organizing their lives around achieving them. Diogenes was offering an exit from the competition, not through dropping out and becoming irrelevant, but through transcending the game entirely and achieving something more valuable: autonomy. The philosophical term was autarkia, self-sufficiency, but it meant more than just providing for your own material needs. It meant being internally complete, needing nothing from outside yourself for happiness or fulfillment. This was the Cynic ideal, and Diogenes embodied it more completely than anyone before or since. The body was disciplined through ascetic training. The mind was disciplined through philosophical practice. The result was someone who could function under any circumstances, who was equally at home in luxury or poverty, who could adapt to any situation without losing their sense of self or their commitment to virtue. This adaptability came up repeatedly in stories about Diogenes. When captured by pirates, he wasn't traumatized. When sold into slavery, he wasn't broken. When confronted by the most powerful men in Greece, he wasn't intimidated. His internal state remained constant regardless of external conditions. Compare this to the average Athenian whose happiness depended on 1,000 contingencies: the success of their business ventures, the health of their family members, the opinions of their neighbours, the stability of the political situation, the favour of the gods. Any of these could change at any moment, plunging them from contentment into misery. They were at the mercy of fortune, of circumstances beyond their control. Diogenes had removed fortune from the equation. He'd reduced his needs to the point where almost nothing could harm him. You couldn't threaten his wealth because he had none. You couldn't damage his reputation because he didn't care about it. You couldn't take away his possessions because he owned nothing worth taking. You couldn't exile him because he'd already rejected the very concept of homeland. He'd made himself invulnerable through systematic reduction. But the project wasn't purely defensive. It wasn't just about protecting himself from harm. It was about creating the conditions for perfect freedom. Freedom to pursue virtue without compromise or distraction. This was the positive goal that justified all the negative renunciations. Virtue, for the Cynics, meant living according to reason and nature. Reason told you what was truly valuable: wisdom, courage, justice, self-control. Nature told you what was truly necessary: food, water, basic shelter. Everything else was convention, opinion, empty social fiction. The virtuous person recognized this and organized their life accordingly. This sounds simple, but demanded enormous courage, because living by these principles meant rejecting almost everything your society valued. It meant accepting poverty, discomfort, and social rejection. It meant being laughed at, insulted, sometimes physically attacked. It meant watching other people pursue wealth and status and honor, while you pursued something invisible and unrecognized. Most people couldn't sustain it. They'd try for a while, then gradually drift back toward conventional values. They'd start caring again about what others thought, start wanting things beyond bare necessities, start making compromises. The pull of social conformity was incredibly strong. Diogenes never compromised. That's what made him dangerous, and that's what made him influential. He proved it was possible to live completely outside conventional structures, and not just survive, but thrive. He was healthier, happier, and more free than the wealthy merchants and prominent citizens who looked down on him. This created a permanent critique of Athenian society. As long as Diogenes was visible in the agora, living in his jar, begging his food, and openly defying every social convention, he was proof that the system was optional. People didn't have to play the game. They could opt out radically and be better off for it. The authorities couldn't do anything about him. He wasn't breaking any laws, at least not in ways they could prosecute. Public indecency wasn't really a crime in ancient Athens, and even if it had been, what could they do? Fine him? He had no money. Imprison him? He was already living in conditions most people would consider imprisonment. Exile him? He'd already been exiled once, and it had only made him more committed to his philosophy. So he remained, a permanent fixture in the agora, a living challenge to everything Athens claimed to value. And people came to watch him, to listen to him, to argue with him. Some came to mock, some came to learn, all of them left thinking. The thinking wasn't purely philosophical entertainment, it had consequences, because once you started questioning one convention, you had to question them all. If wealth and status were arbitrary, what about family bonds? What about loyalty to your city? What about the gods themselves? Diogenes pushed every question to its logical extreme. When asked where he came from, he gave an answer that had never been given before. I am a citizen of the world, anaro cosmopolites, a word that probably didn't exist before he spoke it. This was revolutionary. In ancient Greece, your identity was inseparable from your city. You weren't just a person. You were an Athenian, a Spartan, a Corinthian. Your city defined your legal status, your religious obligations, your entire social existence. Exile wasn't just inconvenient, it was a kind of death, a severing from the only community that gave your life meaning. Diogenes rejected the entire framework. Borders were artificial, cities were human constructions. The universe was your true home, and every human being was your fellow citizen. This made him perhaps the first cosmopolitan in Western philosophy, the first person to articulate a conception of humanity that transcended local allegiances. But he wasn't proposing some naive universal brotherhood. He was making a harder point. If you're a citizen of the world, you're not really a citizen of anywhere. You have no special obligations to Athens or to any other city. You can criticize freely, because you have no patriotic attachments to defend. This was dangerous thinking. Athens valued its citizens' loyalty intensely. The city had just fought a long, brutal war with Sparta. Allegiances mattered. Questioning them could get you executed, as Socrates had discovered. Yet Diogenes questioned them constantly and suffered no official punishment. Why? Partly because he was too absurd to take seriously as a political threat. He wasn't organising movements or writing treatises. He was living in a jar and eating onions. Authorities could dismiss him as a harmless eccentric, but he was also protected by his complete lack of ambition. He wanted nothing from the state, so the state had no leverage over him. You can't threaten someone who's already rejected everything you have to offer. This gave him a freedom that more respectable philosophers lacked. Plato had to be careful. He had wealthy students, relationships with rulers, a school to maintain. He couldn't afford to alienate powerful people. His philosophy remained politically cautious, revolutionary in metaphysics, but conservative in practice. Diogenes had no such constraints. He could say anything to anyone. When Plato defined a human being as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken, walked into the academy, and announced, "Here is Plato's human." The story's famous, and like most stories about Diogenes, we can't verify it, but it captures something true about their relationship. Plato dealt in abstract definitions, logical categories, theoretical distinctions. Diogenes dealt in concrete realities, practical demonstrations, physical proof. Plato's definition was technically correct. Humans are indeed featherless bipeds, but the definition was also useless. It told you nothing about what makes humans human. Wisdom, virtue, reason, consciousness, none of that appeared in the definition. You could satisfy the definition with a plucked chicken. Diogenes was making a point about the limits of abstract philosophy. You can create elaborate systems, complex arguments, sophisticated definitions. But if your philosophy doesn't connect to lived reality, if it can be undermined by a plucked chicken, what's it worth? This wasn't anti-intellectualism. Diogenes was educated, literate, capable of sophisticated argument when he chose to engage. But he believed philosophy should be practical, embodied, lived. Theory without practice was empty. Words without action were meaningless. So he demonstrated his philosophy through his life. Want to know what self-sufficiency means? Look at me. I need nothing. Want to understand freedom? Watch me. I'm not controlled by anything. Want to see virtue? Here it is, in how I live, not in what I say about it. This approach made him difficult to refute. You could argue against Plato's theory of forms by pointing out logical problems. But how do you argue against Diogenes? He's standing in front of you, living proof that his philosophy works. He's happier than you despite owning nothing. He's freer than you despite having no rights. He's more virtuous than you despite rejecting all your moral conventions. The only way to refute him would be to live differently and be happier. But who was happier? The wealthy merchant worried about his ships, his investments, his rivals, the politician anxious about his reputation, his alliances, his enemies, or the man in the jar with no concerns beyond his next meal. Diogenes forced an uncomfortable comparison, and the comparison usually favoured him, at least in terms of peace of mind. He slept soundly. Most people didn't. He feared nothing. Most people feared everything. He wanted nothing. Most people wanted constantly and desperately. His encounters with other philosophers became legendary, partly because they dramatized fundamental disagreements about what philosophy should be. When Aristippus, a philosopher who taught that pleasure was the highest good, saw Diogenes washing vegetables, he remarked, "If you had learned to pay court to kings, you wouldn't have to wash vegetables." Diogenes replied, "If you had learned to wash vegetables, you wouldn't have to pay court to kings." Perfect reversal. Aristippus thought he was free because he could access pleasure through his connections with the powerful. Diogenes thought Aristippus was enslaved precisely because he needed those connections. Real freedom meant needing nothing, not even access to pleasure. The exchange revealed competing visions of the good life. Aristippus pursued pleasure intelligently, through calculated relationships and sophisticated tastes. Diogenes pursued virtue absolutely, through radical independence and total simplicity. Both claimed to be free, both claimed to be happy, but their freedoms and happinesses were incompatible. Diogenes' position was more extreme and more consistent. Aristippus still needed things: money, access, social connections. These needs created vulnerabilities. A king could withdraw favour, wealth could be lost, pleasures could become unavailable. Diogenes needed nothing that could be taken away, so he remained invulnerable. But his invulnerability came at a cost most people wouldn't pay. He lived in poverty, ate poor food, slept rough, endured physical discomfort constantly. He had no intimate relationships, no family, no home. He was alone, permanently, by choice. Was this a good life? Depends on what you value. If you value comfort, connection, pleasure, beauty, no. If you value only virtue and freedom, yes. Diogenes made the trade deliberately. He wasn't ignorant of what he was giving up. He'd been educated, wealthy, privileged. He knew what conventional success felt like. He'd chosen to reject it. This choice fascinated people because it seemed impossible. How could anyone voluntarily give up everything? It violated basic human psychology. We're social animals who need connection. We're comfort-seeking creatures who avoid pain. We're status-conscious beings who care about reputation. Diogenes appeared to have transcended all of this. He'd somehow reprogrammed himself, eliminated normal human desires, become something other than what humans usually are. A philosopher in the truest sense, someone who'd transformed themselves through commitment to an idea. But had he really eliminated desire? Or had he just redirected it? Instead of desiring wealth, he desired poverty. Instead of desiring respect, he desired contempt. Instead of desiring comfort, he desired hardship. The desires remained, only their objects changed. This interpretation makes him less superhuman, but more interesting. He wasn't beyond desire. He was someone who'd successfully reoriented his desires toward goals that made him invulnerable to fortune. And that's teachable, at least in theory. You can't eliminate desire. You're human. But you can train yourself to desire the right things, things that can't be taken away, things that depend only on yourself. Virtue, wisdom, self-control, these are internal goods. Once you have them, nobody can remove them. They're not subject to fortune or other people's actions. This makes them uniquely valuable if your goal is security and independence. External goods, wealth, status, pleasure, are always vulnerable. They depend on circumstances beyond your control. You can lose them through bad luck, other people's decisions, or simple change. This makes them fundamentally unreliable as sources of happiness. So Diogenes' strategy was to invest everything in internal goods and nothing in external ones. Train yourself in virtue, wisdom, self-control. Make those your goals. Once you have them, you're secure. Nothing can harm you because nothing you value can be taken away. This sounds simple but demands extraordinary discipline, because humans are hardwired to care about external goods. We evolved to seek food, shelter, mates, status. These drives are deep, biological, nearly impossible to override completely. Diogenes managed it through constant training. Ascesis, the Greeks called it. Systematic practice aimed at reshaping yourself. He deliberately exposed himself to cold, heat, hunger, discomfort. Not as punishment, but as training, strengthening himself against these sensations until they no longer controlled him. He was building psychological resilience through physical challenge, making himself capable of enduring anything by regularly enduring difficult things. This wasn't masochism, It was strategic. Every discomfort he could learn to tolerate was one less thing that could be used against him. The training extended to social discomfort. He systematically violated taboos, not for shock value, but to eliminate shame. If you can do anything in public without embarrassment, social pressure becomes powerless. You've removed the mechanism through which society controls behavior. This was the meaning of his shamelessness. Not that he lacked all shame, he was still capable of moral judgment, but that he'd eliminated the specific shame attached to violating social conventions. He could masturbate in public because he'd trained himself not to feel embarrassed by natural bodily functions. He could beg because he'd eliminated the shame of poverty. He could be insulted because he'd stopped caring about reputation. Each eliminated shame was a freedom gained. And freedom was the goal, freedom to pursue virtue without compromise or distraction. This required removing all the hooks society uses to control people: desire for wealth, need for approval, fear of poverty, shame about appearance, concern for status. Remove these and you're ungovernable. Not in the sense of being criminal or chaotic, Diogenes wasn't advocating lawlessness, but in the sense of being psychologically independent. Your behavior is guided by reason and nature, not by social pressure or personal fear. This made him the freest person in Athens, freer than the richest merchant, freer than the most powerful politician, freer even than the philosopher kings Plato imagined, because his freedom was internal, unconditional, permanent. It couldn't be voted away, stolen, or lost to changing circumstances, but it was also lonely. Radical independence means radical isolation. If you need nothing from anyone, you have no reason to form close bonds. Relationships become optional, even burdensome. You're entirely self-contained. Diogenes seemed to accept this. He had followers, students who tried to imitate his lifestyle, but he doesn't appear to have had friends in any meaningful sense. He had no family. He formed no lasting attachments. His philosophy precluded deep connection, because deep connection creates vulnerability. If you love someone, they become a weakness. Their suffering affects you. Their needs constrain you. Their death devastates you. To be truly invulnerable, you must love no one, or at least love no one so deeply that their loss would harm you. This is the dark side of Cynic philosophy. It achieves security through isolation, freedom through disconnection. You become invulnerable by becoming alone. And for most people, that price is too high. We'd rather be vulnerable and connected than invulnerable and alone. Diogenes was willing to pay it. Whether he was happy in any recognizable sense remains unclear. He claimed to be. He certainly seemed at peace. But peace through elimination of all attachments isn't what most people mean by happiness. Still, his example remained powerful. Because even if you weren't willing to go as far as he did, his philosophy raised questions you couldn't ignore. How much of what you think you need do you actually need? How much of what you desire is genuine? And how much is socially constructed? How much of your anxiety comes from circumstances, and how much from your reaction to circumstances? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're worth asking, and asking them led to his most radical teaching, cosmopolitanism. When someone asked where he was from, Diogenes gave a one-word answer that changed political philosophy forever. Cosmopolites, citizen of the world. This was revolutionary. In ancient Greece, your identity was your city. You were Athenian, Spartan, Corinthian. The polis defined everything. Your rights, your obligations, your gods, your laws, your loyalty. Being exiled meant losing your identity. You became nothing. Diogenes rejected the entire framework. He wasn't from Sinope or Athens or anywhere else. He belonged to the cosmos, to the universe itself. No particular city could claim him. No particular laws bound him except natural law. No particular customs applied to him except those dictated by reason. This wasn't just philosophical abstraction. It had practical implications. If you're a citizen of the world, you have no enemies. Athenians and Spartans might be at war, but that's their problem. It doesn't concern you. You recognize the common humanity in both sides. The arbitrary divisions that lead people to kill each other become visible as arbitrary. If you're a citizen of the world, you have no superiors based on birth. Kings and slaves are equally human, equally capable of virtue or vice. The social hierarchies that seem natural and inevitable dissolve. What matters is character, not origin. If you're a citizen of the world, you can feel at home anywhere, or nowhere depending on how you look at it. You don't need a homeland because the whole world is your home. You don't need fellow citizens because all humans are your fellow citizens. This cosmopolitanism was dangerous. City-states depended on loyalty. Citizens were expected to fight for their city, to prioritize its interests over all others, to view foreigners with suspicion. Diogenes was teaching people to see these loyalties as conditional, even fictional, to recognize that the person on the other side of the border was fundamentally the same as them. The Stoics later adopted this cosmopolitan vision and made it central to their philosophy. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, would write in his private notes, "My city and country, so far as I am Antoninus, is Rome, but so far as I am a man, it is the world." That's Diogenes speaking through a Stoic emperor 2 centuries after his death. But Diogenes took cosmopolitanism further than the Stoics would. For him, it wasn't just an abstract ideal, it was a lived reality. He really did treat everyone the same, from beggars to kings. He really did ignore all claims to authority based on status. He really did live as though national boundaries didn't exist. This brings us to the most famous encounter in his life, the meeting with Alexander the Great. Multiple versions of this story exist, but the core remains consistent. Alexander, the most powerful man on earth, heard about this strange philosopher and went to see him. He found Diogenes lying in the sun near Corinth. Alexander approached with his guards. Here was the conqueror of the known world, the king of Macedonia, the ruler of an empire stretching from Greece to India. And there was Diogenes, a homeless beggar living in a jar, owning nothing. Alexander asked if there was anything he could do for him, any gift he desired, any favour he needed. The ruler of the world was offering the beggar anything within his power to grant. Diogenes looked up at him. "Yes, stand a little to the side. You're blocking my sun." That was it. The only thing Alexander could offer that Diogenes wanted was to move, to get out of the way, because even the greatest king in the world was just an obstruction between Diogenes and natural warmth. Alexander supposedly said afterward, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." This story has been told and retold for over 2,000 years because it captures something essential about power and freedom. Alexander had conquered nations. Diogenes had conquered himself. Alexander commanded armies. Diogenes commanded nothing and no one. But which man was truly free? Alexander needed constant conquest to maintain his power. Diogenes needed nothing. Alexander's empire would fall apart after his death. Diogenes' philosophy would outlast empires. Alexander was bound by the demands of ruling. Diogenes was bound by nothing except his own reason. The encounter shows why Diogenes called himself a dog. Dogs don't care about your wealth or status. They're completely indifferent to human hierarchies. A dog treats a king the same as a beggar. Diogenes had achieved that indifference through philosophy. But was he happy? Did this radical independence produce a life worth living? The sources suggest he thought so. When asked what the most beautiful thing in the world was, he answered, "Freedom of speech." When asked what was most difficult, he said, "To know yourself." When asked what creatures bite most cruelly, he distinguished, among wild creatures the slanderer, among tame the flatterer. These responses show someone who valued authenticity and honesty above all else. Someone who saw most human interaction as performance and pretense, someone who found conventional life unbearable because it required constant self-suppression. His relationship with other philosophers reveals more about his character. He reserved special contempt for Plato, who represented everything Diogenes opposed: abstract theorizing, aristocratic pretension, disconnection from lived experience. The most famous Plato story involves definition. Plato had defined humans as featherless bipeds. Very philosophical, very abstract. Diogenes plucked a chicken and brought it to Plato's academy. Behold, Plato's human! This forced the Platonists to revise their definition to a featherless biped with broad flat nails. But that missed Diogenes' point entirely. You can't capture what a human is through clever definitions. You have to look at how humans actually live, what they actually need, what actually makes them flourish or suffer. Another time, Plato saw Diogenes eating lentils and said, "If you had paid court to Dionysius, you wouldn't have to eat lentils." Diogenes replied, "If you had learned to eat lentils, you wouldn't have to pay court to Dionysius." This exchange reveals the fundamental difference. Plato was willing to flatter tyrants to maintain his comfortable lifestyle. Diogenes had eliminated the needs that made flattery necessary. One compromised for comfort, the other remained uncompromised because he needed nothing. But these stories also reveal something darker. Diogenes was relentlessly negative. He mocked, criticized, exposed, undermined. What did he actually build? What did he create besides his own freedom? The answer: not much. Cynic philosophy was primarily destructive. It tore down conventional values, exposed hypocrisy, challenged assumptions. But it didn't construct alternative institutions or systems. It just said no to everything. This is why Cynicism never became a mass movement. Most people need more than negation. They need community, meaning, purpose beyond mere survival. Diogenes offered radical freedom, but freedom toward what? Freedom to do what? His answer seemed to be freedom to live according to nature and reason. But what does that actually look like beyond rejecting conventional values? The Cynics never developed a detailed positive program. They knew what they were against, but were vague about what they were for. Still, the negative critique was valuable. Sometimes you need someone to point out that the emperor has no clothes, that social conventions are arbitrary, that much of what seems necessary is actually optional. Diogenes provided that service. That his teaching method was memorable, if nothing else. He taught through shock and example, rather than lectures and arguments. When young men came to study with him, he didn't accept them as students in any formal sense. He just lived his life and let them watch. If they could handle it, they learned. If they couldn't, they left. One student asked how to become a philosopher. Diogenes handed him a fish and told him to carry it through the marketplace. The student was embarrassed and refused. Diogenes said, "A fish defeated you." The lesson: if you can't handle minor social embarrassment, you'll never achieve the shamelessness required for philosophical freedom. This pedagogical approach was brutal but effective. It filtered out anyone unwilling to pay the price. Philosophy wasn't about studying texts or attending lectures. It was about transforming yourself through practice, through ascesis, through systematic training that eliminated all weakness and dependency. But how many people actually wanted that transformation? Diogenes attracted followers, yes, but the Cynic movement remained small and marginal. Most people looked at his lifestyle and decided the freedom wasn't worth the cost. And there was a cost. Diogenes lived into old age, surviving into his 90s according to some accounts. But those were 90 years of hardship, sleeping rough, begging for food, enduring mockery and occasional violence, being universally recognized but having no real friends. Near the end of his life, he was captured by pirates while traveling to Aegina. They sold him as a slave to a man named Xeniades in Corinth. When asked what he could do, Diogenes replied, govern men. Xeniades brought him, supposedly saying, "Here is a man who needs a master." But Diogenes quickly reversed the relationship. He became tutor to Xeniades' sons, teaching them the Cynic way of life. Eventually, he was treated as family rather than property, living with them in Corinth until his death. Even as a slave, he remained free in the only way that mattered to him, internally. His legal status changed nothing about his actual condition. He still owned nothing, wanted nothing, feared nothing. Slavery couldn't diminish him because it couldn't touch what he valued. This demonstrates the ultimate test of his philosophy. In the worst possible circumstances, with no rights and no power, he maintained his integrity. The principles that worked when he was free also worked when he was enslaved. They were truly universal, truly unconditional. His death fits his character. Multiple versions exist naturally. One says he died from eating raw octopus. Another claims he held his breath until he expired. A third suggests dog bite led to infection. The variety of accounts suggests nobody actually knew, but everyone wanted to tell a story that matched his philosophy. The Corinthians supposedly erected a pillar with a marble dog on top to mark his grave. Whether this actually happened is questionable, but the image is perfect, a monument to the man who called himself a dog, who lived like a dog, who achieved through that degradation a kind of freedom others only dreamed of. His influence outlasted his lifetime significantly. The Cynic school continued for centuries. Later, Stoicism absorbed many Cynic ideas while softening their most extreme elements. The Stoics kept the emphasis on virtue, the indifference to external circumstances, the cosmopolitan outlook. But they dropped the deliberate shamelessness, the public masturbation, the aggressive poverty. This made Stoicism more accessible and respectable. You could be a Stoic and still participate in society, hold property, maintain relationships. You didn't have to live in a jar and insult everyone you met. Marcus Aurelius proves you could even be a Stoic emperor. But something was lost in that respectability. The Stoics compromised where Diogenes never did. They tried to have it both ways, philosophical principles and social acceptance. Diogenes would have scorned that attempt. For him, you either lived the philosophy completely or you didn't live it at all. His legacy raises an uncomfortable question. Was he right? Not if the question is whether his specific lifestyle was necessary for virtue. You don't have to live in a jar to practice Cynic principles. But if the question is whether complete consistency between beliefs and actions matters, then yes, he was right about that. Most people claim to value things they don't actually value. They say family matters most while working 80-hour weeks. They talk about authenticity while curating social media personas. They preach simplicity while accumulating possessions they never use. Diogenes proved it's possible to close that gap, to actually live according to your stated values. The cost is enormous, but the possibility exists. The question becomes, what are you willing to sacrifice for integrity? For most people throughout history, the answer has been not that much, and that's fine. Society requires compromise. Civilization depends on people who participate in its institutions rather than mocking them from the sidelines. But Diogenes shows us what the alternative looks like. What happens when someone refuses every compromise, rejects every social convention, and pursues virtue with absolute single-mindedness? The result is impressive and horrifying in equal measure. His influence extended far beyond his immediate followers. The Stoics absorbed his emphasis on virtue while making it socially acceptable. Epicurus took his focus on self-sufficiency and built a gentler philosophy around it. Early Christians saw in his poverty and contempt for worldly power a prototype for their own ascetic traditions. The Desert Fathers, who retreated to caves in Egypt to pray and fast, were following a path Diogenes had mapped out centuries earlier. They just added God to the equation. Medieval monks living in deliberate poverty rejecting wealth and status, pursuing virtue through deprivation. They're all spiritual descendants of the man who lived in a jar in Athens. Even secular figures absorbed his influence. Thoreau at Walden Pond, deliberately simplifying his life to discover what was essential, was conducting a cynic experiment. Gandhi's voluntary poverty and rejection of British goods followed Diogenes' logic. Every time someone questions whether they really need what society tells them they need, they're thinking like Diogenes. Every minimalist, every person who downsizes deliberately, every voluntary simplicity movement, they're all echoes of the original cynic. But they're softer echoes, compromised versions, which brings us back to the central tension. Diogenes claimed virtue was the only good. Everything else was indifferent. Wealth, poverty, health, sickness, life, death, none of it mattered. Only virtue. If that's true, then his lifestyle makes perfect sense. Why accumulate anything when it has no real value? Why follow conventions that contradict virtue? Why compromise at all? But if virtue isn't the only good, if other things also matter, comfort, relationships, beauty, knowledge, then his approach becomes unnecessarily harsh, self-destructive even. The question can't be answered abstractly. It depends on what you actually believe about value and meaning. Diogenes himself never wavered. Right up to his death, he maintained his principles. The stories about his final moments reflect his character perfectly. One version says he died from eating raw octopus. He'd always eaten whatever he found, refusing to cook food or prepare it carefully. Perhaps his luck finally ran out. Another claims he held his breath until he died. Suicide by sheer will. A final demonstration that he controlled his life completely, even choosing the moment of his death. A third suggests a dog bite became infected. Fitting, given that he called himself a dog. Killed by his own symbol. We don't know which version is true, probably none of them. But the variety of stories suggests people wanted his death to match his philosophy. A death as uncompromising as his life. He was buried in Corinth, not in his homeland of Sinope. The exile that defined his philosophy was permanent. The Corinthians erected a pillar with a marble dog on top, supposedly marking his grave. The monument, if it existed, would have amused him. A permanent structure honouring a man who rejected permanence. A marble dog for someone who embraced degradation. But monuments aren't really for the dead. They're for the living. The Corinthians needed a way to process what Diogenes had been. The monument made him comprehensible, turned his chaos into something orderly and civic. His actual influence didn't require monuments. It travelled through ideas, through stories, through the succession of philosophers who tried to make sense of what he'd done. The Cynics continued as a distinct school for several centuries after his death. They wandered ancient cities, begging, mocking, teaching, through demonstration rather than lecture. They were easily recognised by their ragged cloaks, their walking sticks, their deliberate filth. Most were nowhere near as extreme as Diogenes. They softened his approach, made it more palatable. They kept the voluntary poverty and the criticism of convention, but dropped the public masturbation and the aggressive confrontation. This dilution was probably necessary for the philosophy to survive. Pure Diogenes was too intense for sustained practice, but something vital was lost in the softening. The Stoics took the next step. They absorbed Cynic ideas about virtue and self-sufficiency, but made them respectable. You could be a Stoic and still hold property, maintain a career, participate in politics. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, was a Stoic. Imagine Diogenes as emperor. Impossible. The role itself contradicted everything he believed about power and status, but the Stoics made the philosophy workable. They showed that you could pursue virtue without becoming a social outcast. You could close some of the gap between ideals and practice without closing it completely. This pragmatism allowed Stoicism to become massively influential. It spread throughout the Roman world, influenced early Christianity, and eventually became one of the foundational philosophies of Western thought. Diogenes would have called it a betrayal, a compromise that gutted the philosophy of its power. And he'd have a point. Stoicism at its best is admirable. At its worst, it becomes a rationalization for accepting unjust power structures. External circumstances are indifferent, can mean I don't need material goods to be happy, but it can also mean I won't fight oppression because it doesn't really matter. Diogenes never fell into that trap. His indifference to externals never translated into acceptance of injustice. He mocked tyrants, he challenged authority, he exposed hypocrisy wherever he found it. His philosophy was inherently critical, inherently subversive. You couldn't practice it without challenging the status quo. The Stoics tried to separate the internal work of virtue from external social structures. Diogenes knew that was impossible. The two were connected. You couldn't pursue virtue without confronting the society that made virtue difficult. This is why he remains dangerous, not just historically, but now. His philosophy can't be domesticated. It can't be turned into self-help platitudes or corporate training materials. If you actually follow his logic, you end up questioning everything. Your career, your possessions, your relationships, your entire way of life. You start wondering what you really need versus what society has convinced you to want. Most people don't want to go there. The questions are too uncomfortable. The answers might require too much change. So Diogenes remains a historical curiosity, someone to read about, maybe admire from a distance, but never seriously emulate. We tell ourselves his approach was too extreme, that times have changed, that modern life is more complex than ancient Athens, all of which is true. But the core challenge remains unchanged. He asks, what do you actually value? And are you living according to those values? For most people, the honest answer is no. There's a gap between stated values and lived behaviour, between what we claim matters and what we actually pursue. Diogenes eliminated that gap entirely. At tremendous cost, yes, but the achievement stands. He proved it's possible to live with complete philosophical integrity. The question is whether that integrity is worth the cost, whether closing the gap matters enough to sacrifice comfort, status, relationships, everything that makes life pleasant. For Diogenes, the answer was obvious. Virtue mattered. Everything else didn't. The choice was simple, even if the execution was hard. For the rest of us, it's more complicated. We have responsibilities, relationships, commitments. We can't just drop everything and move into a jar, but we can ask the question. We can examine the gap between our values and our lives. We can consider what we're willing to change. That's Diogenes' real legacy. Not his specific lifestyle choices, but his insistence that philosophy matters, that beliefs should shape behaviour, that integrity requires consistency. He demonstrated what that looks like when taken to its logical extreme. The demonstration is useful even if we don't follow the example completely, because once you've seen the extreme, the middle ground becomes more visible. You understand what full consistency would require, which helps you decide how much consistency is actually necessary. Maybe you don't need to live in a jar, but maybe you also don't need the 4-bedroom house you're working 60 hours a week to afford. Maybe you don't need to masturbate in public, but maybe you also don't need to care so much what strangers think of you. Maybe you don't need to own literally nothing, but maybe you own things you don't need and never use. Diogenes provides the measuring stick, the absolute standard against which partial efforts can be judged. And he proves that the standard isn't just theoretical. Someone actually lived this way, not in a thought experiment or a philosophical dialogue, but in actual historical reality. That changes everything. It transforms philosophy from abstract speculation into lived possibility. And that demonstration continues to resonate because Diogenes never wrote a systematic philosophy. He didn't leave treatises or dialogues. What survived were stories, anecdotes, incidents witnessed by others. This wasn't accidental. Diogenes understood that philosophy communicated through action is more powerful than philosophy communicated through argument. When Plato defined humans as featherless bipeds, Diogenes could have written a lengthy critique explaining why this definition was inadequate. Instead, he plucked a chicken and brought it to Plato's academy. Here is Plato's human. The point was made instantly, memorably, without a single theoretical argument. This approach made him dangerous to other philosophers. You can respond to an argument with a counter-argument. But how do you respond to a plucked chicken? How do you defend abstract definitions against concrete ridicule? Plato's students were forced to revise their definition, not because they lost a debate, but because they'd been made to look foolish. The same pattern appears throughout Diogenes' life. When Alexander offered him anything he wanted, a conventional philosopher might have engaged in a lengthy discussion about the nature of desire and happiness. Diogenes just asked Alexander to stop blocking the sun. The entire philosophy of self-sufficiency condensed into one request. When people mocked him for living in a jar, he didn't defend his choice with arguments about minimalism. He simply continued living there, demonstrating daily that humans need far less than society claims. The lifestyle was the argument. This performative philosophy explains why his influence outlasted more systematic thinkers. Aristotle wrote volumes on ethics, constructing elaborate theories about virtue and happiness. Most people haven't read Aristotle, but everyone knows the story of Diogenes with his lamp, searching for an honest man. The image sticks because it's vivid, concrete, memorable. The lamp story itself deserves closer examination. Walking through Athens in broad daylight with a lamp, peering at faces, announcing he's looking for a human being. It's theatre, street performance. But the philosophical content is devastating. He's not searching for an honest man, though that's how the story often gets told. He's searching for a human being. The implication being that the people around him aren't actually human. They're not living according to reason, which is what defines humanity. They're living according to convention, following the crowd, never questioning anything. They're human in form, but not in function. This was Diogenes' fundamental critique of Athenian society. The city was full of people who claimed to value wisdom, virtue, the philosophical life. But they didn't actually live it. They paid lip service while pursuing wealth, status, pleasure. The gap between their stated values and actual behaviour was so vast that Diogenes couldn't find a genuine human being among them. The lamp made the criticism theatrical, impossible to ignore. People couldn't just dismiss him as another crank. The image was too striking, and once they paid attention, they had to confront the question, am I one of the people he's searching past? Am I human in name only? This explains why Athens tolerated him, despite his provocations. He could have been arrested, exiled, executed, but the city allowed him to stay, living in his jar, performing his demonstrations. Partly because he was entertaining, partly because they didn't take him seriously enough to see him as a real threat, but partly, perhaps, because some people recognized value in what he was doing. Even if you disagreed with his methods or his conclusions, Diogenes forced you to think. He made philosophy unavoidable. You couldn't walk through the agora without encountering him, and once you encountered him, you couldn't ignore the questions he raised. This is what separates him from modern performance artists or provocateurs. The shocking behaviour wasn't just shock for its own sake. Every action had philosophical content. When he ate in the marketplace, violating social convention, he was demonstrating that there's nothing shameful about satisfying natural needs. When he masturbated in public, he was challenging arbitrary distinctions between private and public behaviour. Modern audiences sometimes focus on the shocking elements and miss the philosophical point. But Diogenes wasn't crude just to be crude. He was conducting experiments in living, testing which social conventions actually served human flourishing and which were just arbitrary rules maintained through habit and fear. His encounter with Alexander demonstrates this perfectly. Here's the most powerful man in the world, offering anything. And Diogenes asks for the one thing Alexander can't refuse, to move slightly. The request exposes the fundamental absurdity of power. All Alexander's armies, all his conquered territories, all his wealth, and he can't give Diogenes what he actually wants, because Diogenes wants nothing Alexander can provide. The sun is free. It belongs to no one. It can't be bought or conquered. By asking only that Alexander stop blocking it, Diogenes demonstrates that the things worth having don't require power or wealth. They're available to everyone if we just stop wanting the wrong things. Alexander's reported response, that if he weren't Alexander, he'd want to be Diogenes, suggests he understood this. Even the conqueror of the known world could recognize that Diogenes possessed something he lacked: complete freedom from desire. Alexander had everything and wanted more. Diogenes had nothing and wanted nothing. Who was actually richer? This paradox runs through all the Diogenes stories. The slave who governed his master, the beggar who mocked the wealthy, the exile who called himself a citizen of the world. In each case, conventional measures of status and success are inverted. The person who should be weak turns out to be strong. The person who should be miserable turns out to be happy. These inversions weren't accidents or tricks. They revealed something fundamental about how status and happiness actually work. External circumstances matter far less than internal state. You can be a slave and still free if your mind is free. You can be wealthy and still enslaved if you're enslaved to your desires. This is why Stoicism, which developed after Diogenes, would place so much emphasis on distinguishing what's in our control from what isn't. The Cynics understood this instinctively. External goods aren't in our control. Other people's opinions aren't in our control. But our own minds, our own judgments, our own responses, those are in our control. Diogenes lived this distinction absolutely. He couldn't control being exiled. He couldn't control being enslaved. He couldn't control what people thought of him. But he could control how he responded. And his response was to maintain complete inner freedom, regardless of circumstances. That freedom is what made him genuinely dangerous. Not to political power. Athens didn't fear him politically, but to the psychological structures that keep people compliant. If someone can be happy living in a jar, begging for food, owning nothing, then all the incentives society uses to control behavior lose their power. The threat of poverty? Diogenes chose poverty. The threat of social exclusion? Diogenes excluded himself. The threat of shame? Diogenes had no shame. What could society do to someone who wanted nothing it offered and feared nothing it threatened? This is why his philosophy remains relevant. We've created systems of control far more sophisticated than ancient Athens. Economic incentives, social pressure, algorithmic manipulation, all designed to keep people wanting the right things and fearing the right consequences. But the basic mechanism is the same. Control people's desires and fears, and you control their behavior. Diogenes demonstrated that this control is optional. You can simply refuse to play. You can identify what you actually need, very little, and stop wanting everything else. Once you do that, the system loses its leverage. This doesn't mean everyone should live in a jar. That's not the point. The point is understanding that the leverage exists, that it operates through manufactured desires and artificial fears, and that recognizing this gives you choices you didn't know you had. Modern consumer culture depends on people believing they need things they don't need. Marketing creates dissatisfaction, then offers products as solutions. Social media manufactures anxiety about status, then sells the means to compete. The entire system runs on generating and exploiting wants. Diogenes offers an exit, not a comfortable exit, not an easy exit, but an exit nonetheless. You can identify your actual needs and stop there. food, water, shelter, human connection. Not much else is actually required. Everything beyond that is optional, negotiable, subject to your own judgment about whether it's worth the cost. The cost isn't just money. It's time, attention, energy, freedom. Every possession requires maintenance. Every desire creates vulnerability. Every status symbol demands protection. The accumulation that's supposed to make life easier often makes it more complicated. This is what Diogenes understood that most people miss. Simplicity isn't deprivation, it's liberation. Reducing needs reduces dependencies. Reducing dependencies increases freedom. The math is straightforward, but the implementation is hard because it requires going against everything society tells you, and society tells you constantly. Through advertising, through social comparison, through the entire structure of how status is signaled and recognized. The message is always the same: you need more. Better clothes, bigger house, newer phone, higher status. The treadmill never stops. Diogenes stopped it by stepping off entirely. He demonstrated that the treadmill is optional. You're on it by choice, even if the choice doesn't feel like a choice because everyone around you is running too, but it's still a choice. And the alternative exists. That alternative isn't poverty, it's sufficiency. Having enough and knowing it's enough. This state is available at almost any income level. The billionaire who wants another billion doesn't have it. The person with modest means who's content has achieved it. It's a mental state, not a bank balance. This is Diogenes' final lesson, the one that makes all the others make sense. Happiness isn't achieved through accumulation. It's achieved through alignment. Aligning your life with your actual values and needs rather than with social expectations and manufactured desires. The alignment requires honesty. You have to identify what you actually value, not what you're supposed to value. You have to distinguish needs from wants. You have to recognize which desires are yours and which were implanted by marketing, peer pressure, or social conditioning. Diogenes made this look easy because he went so far. Total renunciation creates clarity, but you don't have to go that far to benefit from the principle. You just have to start asking the questions. Do I actually need this? Does this serve my real goals? Am I pursuing this because I value it or because society values it? These questions, asked honestly and repeatedly, gradually shift behavior. You buy less, you accumulate less, you simplify more. Not because you're following Diogenes' example exactly, but because you're following his method, examining conventional assumptions and rejecting the ones that don't serve you. This process is uncomfortable. It means acknowledging that you've been pursuing things you don't actually want. It means accepting that much of what you own is unnecessary. It means recognizing that you've been running someone else's race. But the discomfort leads to clarity, and the clarity leads to freedom. That freedom is what Diogenes proved possible. Not theoretical freedom, not abstract philosophical freedom, actual lived, demonstrated freedom. A human being standing in front of Alexander the Great, needing nothing the conqueror could offer. That image persists because it shows us what we could be if we were brave enough to want less. The story ends, but the question doesn't. 24 centuries have passed since Diogenes died in Corinth. Empires have risen and fallen. Technologies have transformed how we live. The world he knew has vanished completely. Yet here we are, still talking about a man who lived in a jar and owned nothing. Why? Because the fundamental problem he identified hasn't changed. We still confuse what we need with what we want. We still let social convention dictate our choices. We still pursue things that don't actually make us happy because everyone else is pursuing them. The details are different, the mechanism is identical. Diogenes didn't solve this problem. He just showed us what the solution looks like when taken to its absolute limit. Complete renunciation, total simplicity, radical honesty. It's extreme, impractical for most people, probably unnecessary. But seeing the extreme helps clarify the middle ground. You don't have to live in a jar to ask whether you need the house you're buying. You don't have to beg for food to question whether your career is worth the hours it demands. You don't have to masturbate in public to stop caring so much about strangers' opinions. The principle scales, the method adjusts. What doesn't adjust is the core challenge, aligning what you do with what you actually value. Most people never attempt this. They inherit values from their culture, adopt goals from their peers, pursue success as defined by others. They're living someone else's life, chasing someone else's dreams, measuring themselves against someone else's standards. Diogenes refused. He rejected the entire framework, identified what mattered to him: virtue, freedom, living according to nature, and organized his life around that. Everything else was eliminated as distraction. The result was a life most people found appalling, but which he claimed was happy. Was he happy? We can't know for certain. Happiness is subjective, internal, impossible to verify from outside. But he maintained his lifestyle for decades. He never compromised. He died at 90, having lived exactly as he chose. That suggests satisfaction, at least with his choices. The more important question is whether his approach offers anything to people who aren't willing to go that far. And it does. Not as a blueprint, but as a tool for examination. Every time you feel dissatisfied despite having enough, you're encountering the problem Diogenes identified. Every time you pursue something because you think you should rather than because you want to, you're living in the gap he exposed. His solution was extreme, but the problem is universal. The gap between stated values and lived behavior exists for almost everyone. We claim family matters most while working constantly. We talk about experiences over possessions while accumulating things we never use.